We're back with our guest, Monsieur Yves Giroux. He is the Parliamentary Budget Officer. Talked a little bit before the break about the tax situation. I know it's something that the Parliamentary Budget Office does concern itself with because you've had numerous reports on the carbon tax, for instance. So give us a sense of where the budget is going and what the fiscal outlook is when it comes to taxation.
Well, what we've seen is a very strong tax revenues, and it surprises on the upside, in fact. And it's been the case for quite a few years now. Even we were surprised by how strong some types of revenues were coming in, which allowed the government to post slightly smaller deficits than expected, and is probably going to have ongoing impact. And we find out it's due in part to higher inflation than expected before, and slightly stronger economic growth. So revenues are coming in relatively strong, which leads the government to have more fiscal room than expected, even at the time of the fall statement at the end of 2023. But what we find is the government is spending that fiscal room due to stronger revenues and some smaller than expected or lower than expected expenditures. But the government is spending that on future projects. So all that to say, tax revenues are coming in stronger, in good part due to higher inflation, but also due to the introduction of new tax measures. And I'm sure we can talk about that with capital gains inclusion rate. Anybody?
Yeah, exactly. Have you been tracking that? And is that something that your office might be interested in tracking in the future?
Of course. Given the level of interest with the capital gains inclusion rate, which will be increased to 66.6% from 50% as of June 25th, we'll be trying to cost that, but it's not something that's very straightforward to cost.
No.
Because at the same time as the government has increased the inclusion rate, it's also created new carve-outs for that. So for individuals, the first $250,000 of capital gains in any year will still be subject to the 50% inclusion rule. So it's only that above $250,000 that will be subject to the higher inclusion rate. But there's also an increase in the lifetime capital gains for small business owners from about $1 million to $1,250,000 gradually over the next few years, and the introduction of a new lifetime capital gains exemption for entrepreneurs in certain sectors. So there's a couple of things that are moving at the same time. And the government announced the increase in the inclusion rate on April 16th in the budget, but it's coming into force only in June, at the end of June 25th. So this will probably lead to some behavior where some people who would be subject to the higher inclusion rate will bring forward the realization of some of these capital gains. So all these different things happening at the same time make it a bit more difficult to forecast the revenue impact of the increase in the inclusion rate.
Yeah, that would make it worthy of a study by your office then, because I guess there's starting to be predictions that it will not generate the revenue that is attributed to it in the books because people are already changing their tax structures to deal with the additional tax.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the fact that there's $250,000 inclusion at 50%. So the first $250,000 every year for individuals will continue to be included in income at the current rate, won't generate that much revenue. So it's only for those that are having significant capital gains where they'll be taxed at the higher rate. But for corporations, there won't be that inclusion rate at the lower rate for any segment. So it's the 66.6% inclusion rate will apply on the first dollar of capital gain. So the increased revenue will mostly come from the corporate side. And that's probably why we heard so much criticism on that measure from segments of the population, mostly business owners or corporate Canada. But all that to say, as you pointed out, there'll be some tax arrangements and some triggering of capital gains earlier than would otherwise have happened. And that's why I think the first year revenue could even be higher than what the government is expecting. But subsequent years could see lower revenue gains from the capital gains measure.
Right. And thank you for that. We're going to take another brief break. We'll be back with our guest after these messages.